What happens when you lock a no-nonsense liberal firebrand like Bill Maher in a room with a stone-cold Republican strategist like Scott Jennings? You get full-blown clash of ideologies, raw political power, and unfiltered debate. In this must-watch episode of Overtime with Bill Maher, tensions ignite as Maher goes straight for the jugular, blasting Mitch McConnell's Supreme Court legacy and calling out what he sees as a double standard tearing apart the political rulebook. But Jennings doesn't flinch. He fires back, defending McConnell's moves as calculated, legal, and unapologetically strategic. From the stalled Merrick Garland nomination to the rapid-fire confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett, this isn't just discussion. It's a verbal showdown over the very foundation of democracy. And it doesn't stop there. The conversation hits on Trump versus Taylor Swift, media echo chambers, and whether relocating federal agencies could actually heal a divided nation. At its core, this episode is a head-on collision between Maher's blazing passion and Jennings' rock-solid composure. Grab your popcorn, those bringing the heat, and Scott's not blinking.
What do you believe will be Mitch McConnell's legacy? I guess that's who you'd be replacing, right?
Yeah.
When you run for Senate, if you run for Senate.
He's up in 26. Supreme Court, I mean, without question. I mean, he had a long career, 42 years, won 7 elections in Kentucky, but without question, I think his legacy is the court, specifically the Supreme Court. If he doesn't hold that seat open in the 2016 election, I'm not sure President Trump would have won, and then the cascade of appointments that followed will change.
Harris makes his stance crystal clear. You can't claim to follow the Constitution to the letter and then treat it like a customizable checklist, using only the parts that support your political goals. He sees McConnell's actions not just as unfair, but as a serious breach of democratic norms. His frustration boils over the GOP's refusal to let President Obama appoint a Supreme Court justice with nearly a year left in his term, only to turn around and push through Trump's nominee just weeks before the next election. Maher doesn't just call it wrong, he calls it unconstitutional and, more damagingly, a blow to the public's trust in the system. But for him, the bigger issue is what it sets in motion. If one party can keep changing the rules to suit their advantage, how long before the judiciary becomes a political tool rather than a neutral branch of government? That's why this debate goes beyond Garland or Barrett. It's about protecting the credibility and integrity of the Supreme Court itself.
Choose who the Supreme Court nominee. He wanted Merrick Garland, and Mitch McConnell would not even give him a hearing. That was unprecedented. What is the latest bullshit argument why that's okay?
If the bullshit you're referring to is the advise and consent clause in the U.S. Constitution,
no.
That's the argument.
At the time, the argument was it's too close to an election. It was 2015.
Well, that wasn't the full argument. The full argument was we had divided government, and then the American people were going to make a decision, and they did, and they chose a Republican president.
Later.
Well, as I just said in the editorial, if it had been the other way around, you would have went apeshit about it. If somebody had tried, no, you'd have been cool with it.
Well, I lived through the Bush years when the Democrats in the Senate did everything they could possibly do to obstruct George W. Bush from putting judges on the court. So it's not the first time I lived through it.
Not judges. This is Supreme Court.
At the heart of the clash between Bill Maher and Scott Jennings is a core disagreement. What is the true purpose of political power? For Jennings, power is a tool to be taken and used decisively. If you got the votes, you use them, no regrets. Maher, in contrast, argues that power should be exercised within a moral and constitutional framework, one that protects the integrity of democracy itself. It's a classic standoff between political realism and civic idealism, between winning short-term battles and maintaining long-term public trust. But this isn't just a spirited studio debate. It mirrors a much deeper crisis in American politics. When both sides begin to treat constitutional norms as optional and ethics as flexible, the pillars of our system start to crack. Rules lose authority. Trust fades. Power becomes the only thing that matters. That's why Maher's outrage over McConnell's tactics isn't just a political disagreement, it's a warning sign. What Jennings calls smart strategy, Maher sees as slow erosion of democratic values.
Do that, but you get to actually have a hearing. This was completely unprecedented and unconstitutional and illegal. And by the way, your hero, Mitch McConnell, when they asked him if he would do it again, he said, sure. And then they did do it again in reverse. When Amy Coney Barrett was put on the court, it was the exact same thing. It was even closer to an election.
It was literally like 3 weeks, a month before the election.
Well, we didn't have divided government then. We had unifying of political power.
That's the exercise of political power is fine. This is unconstitutional. That's what we're against. We're against going outside the law. They wrote it down. It's very clear. Same thing as some of the things Trump is saying now about a third term. It's very clear. It's in the Constitution. Aren't you the guys who carry the little pocket Constitution in your thing?
Yeah.
Don't you have one under your pocket square there?
Yeah, and in it...
And it says 2 terms. It says a president gets to pick who is the guy they're going to put up in the Supreme Court.
And it says the Senate has to confirm them. And it says the Senate gets to advise and consent on this. And that's up to the Senate on how they do that. It's a co-equal branch.
The conversation keeps circling back to one of the most pressing issues in today's politics, the open hypocrisy both parties display when it comes to constitutional values, especially when power is at stake. Bill Maher zeroes in on Republicans, accusing them of treating the Constitution like a stage prop. He points out the contradiction of proudly displaying pocket-sized versions while ignoring its core principles when it suits their political needs. To him, it's a classic bait-and-switch, wrapping partisan tactics in patriotic rhetoric. Scott Jennings defends the GOP's actions, insisting they fall squarely within the legal boundaries granted by the Constitution. But that, Maher argues, is exactly the problem. When legal arguments are stretched so far they begin to lose all meaning, they stop protecting the system and start being used to exploit it. The result? A democracy stripped of principle, where constitutional values are referenced only when politically convenient. This, Maher suggests, isn't just a Republican flaw, it's a widespread bipartisan failure. But in this particular exchange, it's the GOP's shifting standards and selective outrage that take the spotlight.
The government agencies be doing the same. That's an interesting proposition. I'm not against that from the get for any reason. I mean, everything probably is too concentrated in Washington. It's a little too incestuous, right?
I have a take on this about the media. I think news organizations should incorporate more bureaus outside of New York, LA, and Washington.
Oh, totally.
And Cincinnati and wherever, because the bias in media I'm sure you would agree, can be liberal, but it's like less political to me than it is cultural and class-based. And, I just hire more reporters in Des Moines, hire fewer reporters in D.C.
It wouldn't bother me in the slightest if the Agriculture Department was in Iowa and the Department of Homeland Security was somewhere. I mean, Washington, there's a concentration of people there who only talk to each other. They live in this little bubble. And I think the longer you're in it, the less you have in common with regular Americans. You put some of those government workers out in the middle of the country, they might have a little bit better understanding of how people are feeling about how their government's operating.
Do you work out of